This is perhaps the most important lesson in our training because it describes how to write strengths and recommendations. I'll begin by describing the process for writing strengths and recommendations for each individual building block you assessed. As an example, here are some scores for the instruction building block. To write strengths for this building block, look for the highest scores. And then review the comments and notes you wrote. Decide on 3 to 5 components to list as the strengths. These are areas that truly stood out during the assessment process. There is one 4 on this list for derech eretz, and this should be your top strength. You may also decide to write about the components that received 3s. Be specific in your comments. Here are 2 examples of how to write strengths. 1. Derech eretz. Teachers and students were respectful in their interactions. Teachers began their lessons with minimal redirection of student behavior, and students engaged in activities such as tefillah with appropriate decorum. Office personnel were friendly and supportive to visitors. 2. Teacher engagement. Teachers were engaged in their work and appeared committed to Jewish learning. Most were standing at the board or walking around when students worked. They were focused on students and offered corrections when students wrote Hebrew incorrectly or responded incorrectly in their workbooks. To write recommendations for a building block, begin by looking at the lowest scores. Once again, review the comments and notes you wrote. Decide on 3 to 5 components that stood out during the assessment process and write recommendations on how to improve them. Once again, be specific in your comments and begin each recommendation with a verb. I want to say a bit more about this last piece of advice, which is to begin each recommendation with a verb. Your recommendations are the most important part of the assessment process. By this point, you've gathered up all your data, triangulated your findings, and considered what you've discovered. Now, based on the knowledge you've acquired, you are offering school leaders recommendations on how to improve. I ask you to begin your recommendations with a verb because you are asking school leaders to do something to improve. You are recommending action. Thus, start with a verb. This is obviously a very abbreviated list of verbs, but it gives you an idea of how to start your writing. Let's do some practice. I'd like you to recall our notes and scores for I-1, Classroom Instructional Goals, following our classroom visits. This is a slide you've seen before, but I just want you to take a moment to review it because I'll base my recommendations on what we saw. Here's how I would write a recommendation regarding goals. Note that I am specific and give examples to help explain the recommendation. Your recommendation should be clear and complete. Also, number your recommendations and list them in descending order of importance. 1. Develop, post, and explain goals for each lesson. Teachers should develop and post goals for each lesson that clearly communicate what students need to know or be able to do. Goals could require students to understand, remember, build, create, explain, etc. For example, for a lesson on Hebrew prefixes, the goal could be students will remember and recognize 5 Hebrew prefixes and be able to use 2 in a sentence. For a lesson on Bikur Cholim, the goal could be students will be able to explain in their own words what Bikur Cholim means and give an example of it in their own lives. Teachers should return to the goal at the end of the lesson and ask students to demonstrate that they can do what the goal asks them to be able to do. This could be a short closing activity. Explain what you saw that led you to make this recommendation. The next slide shows how I would do this. Teachers gave students activities such as filling in blanks or completing a written assignment. However, for most lessons, there were no goals set. Although one teacher did explain what she wanted students to be able to do, she orally gave them 4 or 5 tasks to complete. This lesson would have benefited from a short written list to help students remember what they needed to do. One piece that's missing from this recommendation is a description of lesson plans and whether or not they included goals. In our work, we did not see lesson plans, but you will see them when you actually go out and do your site visits. Let's practice with one more recommendation, this time for I2, instructional strategies. Once again, I'm showing you a slide you've already seen to remind you of how I was thinking about what we saw in the classrooms. And of course, you will have your own notes. In this example, I've demonstrated how I triangulated my findings. First, I wrote the recommendation based on observations. 2. Use active learning strategies and help students to make personal meaning. Teachers should use active learning strategies that strengthen student engagement and meaning making. Although there is a time for direct instruction, this should not be the dominant form of instruction. Instead, students should have the opportunity to interact with their peers or to work on projects in small groups. Teachers should structure lessons that encourage children to make personal meaning. So, a lesson on Bikur Cholim could incorporate a time they visited someone who was sick, or a lesson on Israeli history could ask children to talk to their partner about what they saw and what they would have done if they had been alive at that time. Teacher talk should be used at the start and end of lessons to set the goals for the day and then to summarize. But the heart of the lesson should incorporate a variety of active learning strategies. Now, I'm going to support this recommendation by triangulation. During interviews, students said they often felt bored or not very interested in the lessons. Parents also commented that religious school seemed like more of the regular school, which was a shame because kids don't have much of a chance to move around or be active throughout the entire day. The education director said she realized teachers did a lot of direct instruction and workbook assignments, and that she wanted to encourage teachers to design more active lessons. However, on the teacher survey, more than 80% of teachers agreed with the statement, "I use active learning strategies as a regular part of my teaching." This suggests that teachers need professional development on active learning and a variety of teaching strategies. Triangulation strengthens the recommendation. For those of you who scored more than one building block, there is an additional task to complete. The scores, strengths, and recommendations are a form of analysis. You're looking at the parts of the school and helping leaders think about how to maintain what is working and improve areas of weakness. However, the JSASIP also asks assessors to synthesize their findings when scoring more than one building block. I'm going to give you an example of this for a report that includes 3 building blocks: leadership, instruction, and professional development. Let's assume you gave the following scores. In this example, I am assuming you discovered no formal process in place for supervising and evaluating teachers and staff. In addition, during your classroom observations, you saw whole class instruction with students involved in passive activities, such as fill in the blank or taking turns reading aloud. In addition, the school did not have a professional development plan. So you scored all 3 of these components with a 1. Here's what you have in your notes regarding these components. Student survey. 75% disagreed with what I learned in religious school is meaningful to me. Family survey. 70% disagreed with children appear to be engaged in Jewish learning. Interviews. Parents said their children go to religious school so they can get through their bar mitzvah. They're not really engaged in their learning. interview with school committee chair said there is no formal supervision of the education director. The education director said there's no formal teacher supervision process in place. Documents, lesson plans. Plans do not reflect active learning strategies. Professional development plan. Teacher meetings are devoted to reviewing procedures or plans. There is no professional development. Observations. Students are respectful but are passive learners. Teachers rely on direct instruction. Based on all these data, here's how I would write my first recommendation. 1. Design and deliver a professional development plan for teachers that emphasizes active learning strategies and meaning making. Along with this, develop a supervision process that ensures for transfer of learning. That is, a plan that regularly checks that teachers are using the strategies they have learned in their professional development program. This will require a commitment by all segments of the school community. School and synagogue leaders will need to provide resources to support the program and to develop a process for supervising and evaluating the education director. The education director will need to regularly check lesson plans and observe teachers to ensure real change is taking place. Short surveys to teachers, students, and parents can provide ongoing formative assessment to check on changes in student engagement and meaning making. The professional development plan should be ongoing throughout the year and evaluated by teachers and the education director. Most importantly, the education director should report to the school committee on a summative survey of students and parents at the end of the year. Here are some final thoughts about your overall recommendations. Synthesize your findings across the building blocks. Be specific and use your background and knowledge about best practices. And include actions school personnel should take. These recommendations should provide your most thoughtful consideration. They are probably different from the kinds of recommendations school leaders may have heard in the past, because you will have backed up all your comments with various forms of data collected throughout the process of completing the JSASIP. It should give school leaders direction and ideas as they plan for improvement, and you should feel like you've completed an important piece of work.